Thank you very much to the jury, to the director of the BBVA Foundation, and to all of you for being here this afternoon. It is a great honor and a pleasure to address you to talk a little bit about humanities and social sciences, environmental humanities and social sciences, disciplines that are part of the broader scope of environmental studies in the last 3 decades. The award of the BBVA Foundation owes its name to the hypothesis of biophilia proposed by biologist and defender of conservation E.O. Wilson in the 80s. In his classic book, Biophilia, he said that human beings have an innate trend to focus on life and the processes that are close to them. Biophilia, according to him, is a trend to explore and to affiliate with life, is a deep process and a complicated process of mental development. To an extent which is infravalorated in philosophy and in religion, our existence depends on that approach. Our spirit is created from it, and hope comes from its trends. That is what he said. He also added that, upon his opinion, modern biological research converges naturally with biophilia. I'm trying to make the slides go. Can we go back in the slides? Yes, thank you. He said that modern biology has produced a genuinely way of seeing the way which is incidentally congenial to the internal direction of biophilia. In other words, the instinct in this rare case is aligned with reason. As we get to understand other organisms, we will give them more value and we will give ourselves more value. Biophilia and its counterparts, biophobia and ecophobia, have been widely explored and debated in the 4 decades that have gone since Wilson proposed the term, both by scientists, researchers in social sciences, and humanists devoted to the study of the environment. The discussion of the concept by Wilson is broad and anecdotic more than systematic. It's a great memoirs of his life in scientific research and his travels to many places around the world at the service of conservation of biodiversity. What he clearly says in his initial definition is that any innate trend that may exist in human beings needs to develop all through life. And Wilson, he sees the best promise of biophilia in its convergence with scientific reasoning, which he does not consider as something innate. In the last 3 decades, research in humanities and social sciences related to the environment have covered dimensions that Wilson left aside. That is, institutions, social practices, and cultural concepts and frameworks that mold out attitudes of human-specific communities towards natural world in moments of specific historical moments. Biophilia, as many environmentalists would say, has not stopped the degradation of natural environments at great scale as we face alarming rates of global warming, pollution, loss of diversity, amongst other, in the 21st century. Thus, biophilia needs to combine with the analysis of social structures, cultural structures, and political structures to catalyze the changes that may prevent, maybe not the environmental crisis per se, at least their most dangerous consequences, both for humans and for other species. Biophilia, from this perspective, becomes an objective for which we need to collectively work in a place instead of a fact that we can take for granted. It is part of the utopic environmental thinking or the uptopic thinking. It's a concept that I will explain in short. My researches in the last 25 years have focused the transcultural study of the environmental narratives. That is, how we need to go back. That is how environmental crises are understood, are not explained in different places, in different regions and languages, though these crises may seem similar or identical from a scientific point of view. Social structures, cultural practices, and historic memories, not only scientific knowledge, have an influence in the perceptions, experiences, and narratives about environmental crises such as dryness, deforestation, or pollution. The narrative is one of the other social factors that have an influence in the attitudes towards the environment. The theoretician of narrative H. Porter Abbott talks about a master plot for the narrative lines with greater impact in the cultural perceptions, an impact that happens sometimes unconsciously and other times in a clear way. For example, the idea of nature, that nature is a resource that needs to be used to benefit humans, it's a master plot common in European and North American cultures. It's also a narrative that places humans in a place and other biological species in another place. But the master narrative, according to which the earth does not belong to humans, but humans belong to the earth, and that is the earth, a living being, is shared by many communities, indigenous communities in Australia, South America, and North America. This cosmovision also implies that some non-human species, if not all, are relatives of humans. Thus, we find huge diversity in how people see themselves in relation to nature in all around the world. In China and Japan, the kind of nature that is most admired is the one of well-taken care gardens, aesthetic gardens with ponds that are carefully planned and sculpted rocks. Whilst in Canada and the US, for many years, the cultural ideal was wild nature, wildlife, at the least altered by human beings. So you see a painting by Albert Pierstadt, a classical painting of the 19th century, which precisely represents that perception of nature with no human alterations. And that, on and on and on. Ideas and the narratives about what nature is, how relates to humans, how it's beneficial or harmful, and how we should be developed in the future vary from one culture to another and change all throughout history. So knowing which are these narratives and how they create public opinion is crucial to protect the environment. The book by Rachel Carson, Primavera Silenciosa, for example, published in 1962, was really good to mobilize legislation against certain pesticides because Carson systematically compared environmental toxins with radioactive rainfall. Radioactivity in the period of the Cold War was a danger over which the American public was more clear aware of than toxins associated to industrial agriculture. Or, in order to give you another example, the German Green Party in the 70s and 80s prevented any nationalist rhetorics about the beauty of the German mountains or the mystery of its forests because its leaders knew that these topics could take to traumas of the Nazi discourse of blood and earth. And in the last 10 years, in order to give you a more recent example, activists associated to Extinction Rebellion, Greenpeace, and other environmentalist associations have been wearing polar bear suits in public demonstrations to stress that the future of the youngs of the 21st century is as threatened by climate change as the future of polar bears. All these narratives are shaped by their cultural context and calibrated to get the attention of specific audiences. And sometimes they have had some impact internationally, more beyond the audiences for which they were initially conceived. This last example is really interesting, these polar bear suits, because activists clearly assume that the general public knows the case of polar bears. Their survival is threatened by climate change. It's also interesting because activists in these demonstrations say, at least metaphorically, with animal voices. It's a technique that writers and filmmakers that are ecologists have adopted since decades to call the attention on the crisis, environmental crisis, in order to fight for conservation of biodiversity and to foster precisely biophilia. The novelist from the US, Ursula Le Guin, used it at the beginning of the 70s when the ecologist movement was starting to arise. For example, she told a story from the stance of a rat that is being used for experiments in a lab. And she doesn't manage to relate with the scientist with whom it's working. In another case, the direction of the road, the narrative voice is the one of an oak that during its all life observes, sees the modernization of landscape surrounding it with a blend of reluctancy and admiration. And at the same time, as many of you know, documentarist Felix Rodriguez de la Fuente used this narrative strategy with a really striking effects in his radio and television series of the 70s, especially at El Hombre y la Tierra. In some episodes, Rodriguez de la Fuente puts at the forefront scientific observation of animals, their ecology, their behavior, similar to the presentation in other documentaries about the wildlife of those ages, such as the films by David Attenborough or Disney Studios. But in other episodes, he breaks with those conventions and narrates the events from the approach of the animal. For example, in one of the episodes of El Hombre y la Tierra, it starts with the voice of animals, and during the first minutes, the only sound we hear is the howling of the wolves. No comment about the place or the context. When finally we hear Rodriguez de la Fuente's voice, he says the singing of the wolf, and he features it as a melancholic calling, at least when it reaches the human ears. And he associates this sadness with the almost extinction of the Iberian wolf. Its population had reduced to 400 or 500 individuals back then. The narrative that follows counts with the voice of Rodriguez de la Fuente, but he presents the fights of a wolf for her own survival and the survival of her calves systematically from the standpoint of the animal. The wolf is a dedicated mother, tender, really clever, that puts at danger her own life to chase the humans with rifles to protect her calf. Later on, in the episode, she goes back to and feels that some men are getting close, threatening her, and she takes the 4 calves from her pen to another hide, taking them in the mouth one by one, in a race against the clock, against hunters. Finally, she fails. One of the calves dies, and we see her burying it. And that's really surprising. Then hunters find the new hide and they capture the calves that, as Rodrigo de la Fuente says, will be deprived from food. They will be beaten and killed in the village nearby. The last stake of the wolf, she is lying down, and the spectator must read as that she's exhausted and she's in despair, a victim of human hatred. And to conclude, the camera shows once again 3 men with rifles getting closer from the horizon. So you guys have realized that men are seen as the approach is the one of the wolves. I mean, because they are lower to the ground than the men. Of course, this is not the scientific and distant narrative that other documentaries give about wildlife, but it's the explicit adoption of the animals' point of view and their voice to fight against excessive hunting and the extinction of species. Rodríguez de la Fuente, through the perspective of the wolf, is against the master plot of the wolf as the enemy and the competitor of the farmers, and presents these men as lethal predators. And it's well known, the campaign of Rodríguez de la Fuente was a full success. Actually, we have 2,300 wolves in Spain, and their populations increase slowly but in a constant basis. But of course, as we've seen in last weeks, the hunting of wolves will continue, and the tension between communities, urban and rural communities, persists. So the war between men and wolves is not ended. The procedure that Rodrigo de la Fuente to create a world from the approach which is not human has been used since then in fiction narratives and non-fiction narratives in different regions, languages, and cultures. The novelist from Canada, Barbara Gowdy, for example, she published The White Bone in 1999, a book where all the characters are African elephants that fight to survive amidst the poaching at large scale. And in 2015, artists of Puerto Rico, Jennifer Alora and Guillermo Calzadilla, collaborated with writer Ted Chiang to create The Great Silence. It's an installation, a video installation, where there's a Puerto Rican parrot, a member of a critically endangered species, which is addressing humans, specifically to humans that have built the Arecibo telescope in Puerto Rico. Its discourse is with subtitles in the lower part of video, and like the subtitles that translate the dialogue event in a foreign language. And humans, and this is the kind of parakeet that is used, which is endangered, according to the IUCN. Humans use Arecibo to find extraterrestrial intelligence. That's what the parrot says. Their desire to establish a connection so strong that they have created an ear capable of listening throughout all the universe. But I and my colleagues, we're here. Why are they not interested in listening to our voices? We are a non-human species that we can communicate with them. Aren't we exactly what they're looking for? The parrot asks. It is, at least implicitly, a question about the limits of human biophilia. The parrot anticipates the disappearance of its species, and with it, the disappearance of a way of life and a culture. Parrots, for Puerto Rico, we have our own myths. They're more simple than human myths, but I think that humans would love them. Unfortunately, our myths are getting lost as our species is becoming extinct. I doubt that humans will be able to decipher our language before we disappear. So the extinction of my species is not only the loss of a group of birds, it's also the disappearance of our language, our rituals, our traditions. It is the silencing of our voice. Well, here, the narrative of the video explores areas that go beyond the mere biological extinctions to highlight the existence of cultures that are not human and communication ways that will disappear with the disappearance of an animal species. The parrot has no hope about his plea being heard by humans or that the extinction of his species may be prevented. Just as Gaudi, Chang uses the animal perspective to paint a pessimistic panorama about the future of biodiversity. These kind of works don't only raise a question of up to what the extent of biophilia when preventing the extinction of species, but it also question if that empathy with animals or the love for nature are these enough by themselves to stop the world degradation of habitats. In other words, it highlights, at least implicitly, broader questions that are structural, that define and limit the scope of biophilia. But not all writers, artists, and filmmakers adopt such an aseptic perspective when they build narrative worlds from the perspective of animals. French novelist Bernard Werber builds a narrative world populated equally by human characters and ants in his trilogy of the 90s, The Ants, The Day of Ants, and The Ants Revolution. He wrote these novels based on a detailed research about perception, communication, and social structures of the societies of ants. The human plot and animal plots of the first novel are two police parallel stories, and they start to converge when human and ants together develop a communication technology that make linguistic sounds becoming pheromones and vice versa, thus allowing ants transmitting humans the devastating impact that the pesticides have in their communities. The recent trilogy, the most recent one, focuses narrates a more violent world from the approach of cats, where cats ally with humans to start to create a better world. And in both cases, Weber uses knowledge and the percentage of animals to offer alternatives to epistemology and human ethics. In a more serious, the trilogy of ants, and more humoristic, the one in cats. Well, cats, the protagonist cat talks about her owner as my servant. And both series have been bestsellers in the French world. In works such as these ones, Werber starts to develop what the U.S. novelist Kim Stanley Robinson calls optopy in the last 10 years. That is, not the perfect societies imagined by utopic philosophies, but future societies which, with cultures, laws, and institutions, foster a greater social justice. That is, the best possible world taking the circumstances in account. Robinson understands this fight as a continuous and dynamic process and not a permanent status as in the former utopias. And any improvement that we might achieve will always need to be defended against adverse intentions and forces. Optopy, in other words, is a fight, continuous fight, rather than a condition that we might reach once for all. Futuristic novels of Robinson show how the conservation of the environment contributes to improve the fate of human communities. Other authors of ecologist approach take this thinking line a step further. They imagine utopia, a more just society, not only for humans, but also for other species. And sometimes they portray this vision of the future from a perspective which is more than human, that is, animal. The best example in this sense is a novel by writer from Martinique, Patrice Chamoiseau, the Les Neuf Consciences du Mal Fini, the Night Consciousness of Aliancho. In a falcon initially follows its predating instincts, and he doesn't take care to the life of its prey, and he starts to be interested for a colibri, which is really brave, which is rescuing another colibri from the nest of the falcon. And the Malfini, the falcon gets fascinated by the colibri Fufu, and he discovers the environmental crisis. First, the devastation caused by the use of pesticides in a plantation of bananas, which is nearby, then climate change, and all this with when he talks to Fufu and with birds that get to the island. Some, they seemed exhausted of flying. Most looked around, afraid of everything and everyone. When they were asked about why they were so paranoid, they mentioned seasons that came too soon or too late, or that changed and fluctuated out of the old patterns. They talked about seas that were dried, rivers that couldn't get to the ocean, lakes that fermented until becoming just dead mud. They talked about great deserts that were fertile in the past. Where they didn't fly in circles, they get to the places they had in their memories, but they were too early or too late, because instead of the festivities, there was just progressive drought, unusual cold, storms, floodings, tornadoes. Often, they didn't find flowers, no seeds, no insects, nothing that they had were expecting until then, as their knowledge of the species had. And migrants were saying that. And though for me that was crazy, Fufu was really listening with the interest. The reader knows what Malfini doesn't understand right then. It's migrating birds that are disoriented because climate change. But Malfini, the falcon, later on, joins efforts with a group to preserve and protect and restore autochthonous habitats of Martinique that is started by Fufu, an effort that includes different species, including some humans. They have a minor role, humans, in this story, but this narration can be read as an allegory of the human transformation, a twist of the environmental exploitation towards conservation. But the systematically perspective focused on birds gives us a vision of future society where animals are also part of the ethic and the justice, and the sounds of birds that Chamoiseau includes in the narration never allow us to forget that the narrator is not human. Thus, the novel sketches the future ways of biophilia, an utopia of multi-species. There are many other examples of these kind of experiments in different languages and media, communication media to call the attention about the loss of diversity and climate change. Let me conclude with two more examples of in another means. The video game Never Alone, Kishima in Gichuna, for example, it was launched in 2014, was developed by writers and game designers in Nupiaq and Tinglet from the Tribal Council of Cook Inlet in the north of Canada. And the game is based on a traditional story, Inupiaq, Kunuksiakua. The main character is a girl called Nuna, and she lives a series of adventures with her Arctic fox friend. The gamers have to alternate between characters, Nuna and the fox, assuming the role of each one in different moments of the game to overcome different challenges. Nuna and the fox try to determine the causes of strong winds and snowstorms that put their people in danger. This cause is a a nice bad character that has to be defeated in the final battle, alluding climate change. But on the way, they discover that their village has been set to fire and robbed by a villain, I'm sure, alluding to the colonial story of the north of Canada. The video game introduces traditions of oral narrative with the voice of an indigenous old man presenting some short documentaries of cultural practices that the game is based on. Among them, different videos that focus on the relationship of Inuit communities with animals, plants, and the earth. That is, that here too, the animal perspective opens the door to an alternative society integrating humans and other species. In a similar line, another video game called Wolf Quest. I'm sure Rodrigo de la Fuente would have loved it. And in this game, the gamer adopts an avatar, a wolf, and lives the natural life of a love. Hunts, joins a pack, looks for a pen, and in this game, residing in the body of an animal becomes an alternative way of knowing the natural world and relating with this natural world. Narratives about natural world, both in text, films, has helped to catalyze the modern ecologist movements of the last 60 years. The scientific book, Silent Spring of Rachel Carson in the United States, that I've already mentioned, books and documents by Bernard Jimmick about African fauna in Germany, the documentaries of Felix Rodriguez de la Fuente about Iberian fauna in Spain, documents about nature by David Attenborough, and the film about climate change, An Uncomfortable Truth by Al Gore in many countries. And of course, these successful examples of narratives for the general audience were not enough by themselves. They were accompanied by political mobilization and the creation of institutions to reach legal and social changes. But these books and films show that histories and stories that are well told have the power to generate biophilia and foster conservation of the environment. Some activists and scientists express today the desire to have a writer that may repeat the achievements of Silent Spring and mobilize the audience to fight against the loss of biodiversity and climate change. I don't think that this is possible nowadays because the media panorama is much more fragmented than in Carson's era. Multiple television chains by cable, websites, social networks have given way to many small audiences, and each one paying attention to different genre and narrative content. We know by empirical studies that the last decades of environmental narratives, especially the ones that talk about climate change, have a significant impact in the perspective of the viewers or the readers. But we know also that this impact is temporary and tends to vanish after a few months. Thus, we need a great number of different narrators and a wide range of narrative different strategies to continue these tasks started by Carson Rodriguez de la Fuente and many other narrators that help to catalyze the ecologist movements in different regions of the world. These narratives must be presented in many different languages and for many audiences in all the current media panorama, and they must continue to create continuously so that neither environmental crisis of the moment or the utopic visions of the future are forgotten in the media avalanches that we live day after day. This is the work that Environmental Humanities is carrying out with the help of institutions such as the Laboratory for the Environmental Narrative Studies of the UCLA, my university in LA, the Australian Environmental Humanities Hub in Australia, the Environmental Humanities Lab of Stockholm, in the KTH, the Environmental Human Center of the Vrije University of Amsterdam, the Rachel Carson Center of the Ludwig Maximilians Universität of Munich, the group of co-critic research of the Franklin Institute of the Universidad de Alcalá, Institute Mutante de Narrativas Ambientales, who work here in Madrid for several years, and many others are all around the world. All these institutions focus on developing narrative strategies of environmental communication to create the next generation of writers, directors, artists, designers, video game designers, to tell stories that go beyond humans. They worked in collaboration with scientists that contribute with their knowledge about species, ecosystems, and in cooperation with researchers of social sciences that study the dynamics of politics, activism, and environmental communication. In the end, these efforts have the objective of developing the future formula of biophilia. It's a great pleasure and an honor to count on BBVA's foundation as a collaborator with so much visibility and so efficient in these efforts to protect the species that cohabit in the planet with us. Thank you very much for your attention.